Hello everyone, and welcome to our fourth annual Harrington Lecture. This lecture series honors the memory of Father Daniel J. Harrington, S.J., a celebrated scripture scholar, wonderful teacher, and great man. Today, though, we also hold in our hearts another celebrated scripture scholar, wonderful teacher, and great man. Namely, my predecessor as dean, Father Tom Stegman, who died on Holy Saturday after a long struggle with glioblastoma. Now, it's my understanding that Tom was central in bringing the Harrington Award to fruition. Daniel Harrington was not only a teacher and mentor to Tom and stimulated his own desire to be a scripture scholar, Dan was in so many ways a role model to Tom, even in the way both approached their deaths, with an abiding trust in God and hope in the resurrection. As we read in 2 Timothy, "As for me, I am already poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." So we honor tonight not one, but two Jesuits who kept the faith and whose lives reflected even more eloquently than their eminent learning the Word of God that they loved. A day or two ago, I heard a student at the STM say that Tom Stegman knew the Pauline literature so intimately that he was, like his mentor Dan Harrington, a close friend of St. Paul's. So in the last few days, I have found myself imagining Dan leading Tom through that great cloud of witnesses, and after so many years of seeing through a glass darkly, finally introducing Tom to St. Paul face to face. It's a sweet image to keep in our minds in these days of our own loss. Tonight, though, we can find Father Stegman's and Father Harrington's love of the church and their commitment to service and generosity in tonight's presentation, Basements, Potlucks, and the Orange Line, Listening for God in an Urban Parish. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Susan Bigelow Reynolds is Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. Reynolds is a Catholic theologian and ethnographer whose research examines the intersection of ecclesiology and lived Catholicism in contexts of diversity, marginality, and suffering. She is the author of People Get Ready, Ritual, Solidarity, and Lived Ecclesiology in Catholic Roxbury, which draws on years of parish-based ethnographic research here in Boston to examine the question of community in a racially and culturally diverse church, arguing for the retrieval of solidarity as an ecclesial virtue. Her work has examined public ritual, urban Catholic practice, parish closures, and congregational change, migration, motherhood and pregnancy loss, and the Catholic clergy's sexual abuse crisis. Her current project, a study of protest-oriented community stations of the cross, is supported by a grant from the Louisville Institute. Her work has recently appeared in journals such as U.S. Catholic Historian, American Catholic Studies, and Exchange, and in popular publications including The Atlantic, America Magazine, and Commonweal, where she is a contributing writer. She is a regular contributor to conversations on religion and public life in national media, including National Public Radio and the PBS NewsHour. Professor Reynolds holds a BA and an MED from the University of Notre Dame and an MTS and PhD from the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. In 2022, she was honored with the On Eagle's Wings Excellence in Teaching Award by the students of Candler School of Theology. We're delighted to have her back at Boston College with us tonight. Welcome, Professor Reynolds.
Thank you so much for that beautiful welcome. Thank you to Dean McCarthy and to my dear friend Megan de Dios, who is on maternity leave, and to Kara O'Sullivan and everybody here who's been so hospitable and generous. I'd like to begin, if I can, with 3 brief comments in gratitude for this welcome. The first is about Father Dan Harrington, for whom this lecture is, of course, named. I took Father Harrington's post-exilic biblical literature course my first semester as an MTS student at the STM. I had come to BC after 2 years living on the US-Mexico border, and I thought there might be something there for me in a class on texts written by peoples forced from home. The sobriety of Father Dan's approach initially came as a disappointment in my zeal, but before long I realized it was a great gift. He taught me to approach texts with calm and clear-eyed patience, seeking not echoes of my own voice, but rather the voices truly on the page before me, and in and through those voices to seek the voice of God. I am daily shamed by memories of Dan handing back papers graded 24 hours after we submitted them. When my life ends, my students will not be sharing that memory of me. Most of all, I remember working the opening shift at the Theology and Ministry Library on Monday mornings at 8 a.m., and when I'd arrive to unlock the heavy wooden doors, there Father Dan Harrington would be waiting with a canvas bag filled with books he'd spent the week reading and reviewing for New Testament abstracts, ready to be deposited on the front desk and entered into circulation. And then he'd turn around and walk slowly up the hill to begin another week. My second comment is about Father Tom Stegman, who was my New Testament professor at the STM and who taught me more about the Pauline epistles that I could have ever hoped to remember, even if I had kept up with the reading. Tom was generous and brilliant and physically incapable of not smiling his radiant, earnest smile, even as his life was running out. I came to know him during my time at the STM, as countless others did, as one of this community's kindest lights. His death on Holy Saturday was a fitting entry into life with Christ for one who met suffering with such confounding grace. It was Tom who invited me to give this lecture, and I offer it in his memory. It's a coincidence, and also for me an irony, that these 2 men, Father Dan and Father Tom, were both New Testament scholars and were thus responsible for the entirety of my formation in the subfield of theology, about which I continue to know the very least through no fault of either of their own, obviously. Yet, somehow, while writing my dissertation and living in North Carolina with my family, I was hired at a small Catholic college outside of Charlotte to teach Introduction to Scripture. No one was more surprised than me, except maybe Tom Stegman. When I returned to Boston to defend my dissertation, I told him that I'd spent the past year teaching Scripture, and he laughed, and I laughed. He said he was sure it had gone wonderfully, and then we both laughed and pretended that he was right. The final word of gratitude I want to offer is for this community, the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. I returned home a few days ago from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, where I spent Holy Week with a small community of Jesuits, Louis Hotop, Flavio Bravo, and Brian Strasburger, who is a fellow alum of both the STM and the St. Thomas More High School Youth Group in Denver, of which I was also a proud member. They live in the colonia of Cameron Park in Brownsville and minister to migrants along the border in Mexico and unaccompanied minors in US custody. I accompanied Louis and Flavio as they celebrated the Triduum in the migrant encampment, rapidly growing along the river in Matamoros, Mexico, just across the international bridge from Brownsville. There, thousands of migrants, women and men, mothers and children, and babies from Venezuela and Honduras and beyond, have been forced from their homes by economic catastrophe and threats on their lives. They're living in tents and improvised shelters made of tarps and plastic bags, charging their phones with electricity elaborately pirated from streetlights so that they can enter their information every morning at 10 a.m. into the CBP-1 app in hopes of receiving their CITA, their appointment for processing by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which would then enable them to begin the process of applying for sanctuary. Some have been waiting in the encampment for months, others for days or weeks. Others had just arrived when we got there disoriented after crossing the border in Juarez and being laterally deported from El Paso. It's a situation of abject precarity and the most searing example I think I've ever witnessed with my own eyes of the way that the poor are pressed into bearing the crosses of the world. And of the many images from the week that I can't forget, there's one I want to offer to you all this evening by way of both expressing my gratitude to the STM and also beginning the lecture at hand. It's an image from the Good Friday liturgy, the commemoration of the Lord's Passion, which we celebrated in the migrant camp in Matamoros. That liturgy ordinarily begins, as we all recently experienced this Holy Week, as the priests enter the sanctuary in silence and process to the altar and prostrate themselves before the cross, flat on the ground, face down. Right? It's a very jarring thing to witness, even in just an ordinary parish. On Thursday night, it rained ferociously and the ground turned to mud. And in the camp, it lashed apart structures and flooded tents, and no one slept. So we flattened cardboard boxes on the mud, and at the start of the Good Friday liturgy in the camp, Louis and Flavio knelt and silently flattened themselves to the cold ground on the cardboard on top of the mud before the foot of the cross. And they pressed their faces to the same ground upon which everyone there had spent the night, and the soles of their shoes, which faced the sky, were like everyone else's, caked in mud. I offer you this image as a way of explaining what the years I spent here at the STM meant to me vocationally. As I mentioned, I first came to the STM in 2011 to complete an MTS after living in Brownsville, where in 2009, I watched with the rest of my community as the border wall between the United States and Mexico was constructed half-mile from my front yard. I'm not from the Rio Grande Valley originally, but I don't think it's possible to witness the construction of a wall where there wasn't one previously and not take that image into yourself like a scar. I was seeking a way of proceeding in light of what I'd seen and heard, and the discipline of theology seemed to offer a lexicon appropriate to the deepest reality of the situation. I wanted to do theology with muddy shoes. And I encountered at the STM a community of professors and mentors and classmates who deepened and challenged that commitment and made it into something intelligible and responsible and attentive. I arrived here with no money, and because I decided to stay and pursue a PhD in theology, I also left here with no money. As I prepared to move to Boston, following that spark of what can only in retrospect be called providence, but what at the time looked mostly like material necessity, I answered an ad seeking a graduate student willing to live for free in the parish house of St. Mary of the Angels Catholic Church, 6 miles away in Roxbury, in return for 13 hours a week of work. So together with my parish house roommate, Catherine, each week I helped assemble the parish bulletin and shovel the walk and teach Sunday school and coordinate Saturday morning parishioner volunteers to clean the church. And in addition to my room above the parish kitchen and all the potluck leftovers I could eat, I received what was for a lay woman a much rarer gift, the chance to experience the life of a parish from the inside out. The people of St. Mary of the Angels became my greatest teachers of theology. My MTS thesis and dissertation were both ethnographies of St. Mary's and the Eggleston Square community. Later, I was able to complete the archival work needed to construct a real history of the decades before, during, and after Vatican II, from the little considered perspective of a small, poor, interracial city parish. And now, nearly 12 years after I left the Rio Grande Valley for Boston for the first time, I'm finally able to give the project back to the St. Mary of the Angels community in the form of People Get Ready, a book that tries to do theology with muddy shoes. So I'd like to take a moment to invite those folks here from St. Mary of the Angels to stand and be recognized, because in every meaningful way, I really owe this all to them. And with that, empezamos. Let's begin. St. Mary of the Angels is a basement with a roof. If it weren't for the ivory-painted statue of the Virgin Mary gazing tranquilly toward the bus stop from behind a wrought iron gate and an inauspicious sign on the corner, little about the stubby building would resemble a Catholic church. It was built at the turn of the 20th century to serve working-class European immigrants in the Eggleston Square neighborhood of Roxbury, then a streetcar suburb of Boston. Builders broke ground on the church's foundation in 1906, the same year the city's elevated train, the train that would eventually become the MBTA Orange Line, first rumbled over the heads of residents. The new parish signaled Boston Archbishop John Joseph Williams' confidence that Roxbury would soon become a flourishing center of Catholic life. As would-be parishioners awaited the construction of their new church, they gathered for Mass down the block in the West End Street Railway car barn. In a letter circulated to parishioners, their first pastor, Father Henry A. Barry, likened their humble beginning to the nativity story. "The birth of our parish life will be humble," he wrote, "like the beginning of Christianity, for we must not forget that our Lord was born in a stable and laid in a manger. We will not disdain to adore our Lord in humble quarters. It will refresh Bethlehem's story in our minds and fasten its incomparable fragrance on our hearts. We will join our minds and hearts in the noble effort to build Jesus a dwelling place." But building Jesus a dwelling place turned out to be harder than anticipated. As it turned out, Archbishop Williams' vision of a flourishing Catholic future for Eggleston Square and the building plans that accompanied it had been more than a little optimistic. Catholics remained a marginal presence in the neighborhood, and those who were there had little money to contribute to the building effort. When it became clear that the money for the envisioned Gothic church would not be raised, a hasty roof was instead built over the basement chapel in hopes that once enough money came in, the church would be finished. Spoiler alert, the money did not come in. On March 8th, 1908, the first parishioners of St. Mary of the Angels processed down a narrow set of stairs and into their new underground church. More than a century later, St. Mary's remains an unfinished project. Inside, the basement sanctuary evinces generations of slow revisions. Ruddy carpet covers thick floorboards. In the corner behind the choir looms the skyline of a bricolage sound system, its stacked speakers connected by a labyrinth of cables. On the slim crucifix carried by an altar server during Mass, Jesus' left arm clings to the cross by a rubber band looped around his wrist like a scrunchie. If the 20th century was supposed to be a story of upward mobility for American Catholics, St. Mary's had apparently missed the memo. Mid-century Catholicism traded on images of stability, proving its American bona fides by publicly binding together the Catholic faith with symbols of national stability, military service, the Hollywood silver screen, suburban life, the white nuclear family, the university, the presidency. In its own way, the American parish emblematized this stability, mapping notions of holiness and sacramentality onto territorial belonging, onto physical neighborhoods. St. Mary's, however, was kind of the antithesis of this facade, both predating and outlasting it. In many ways, the community it served represented the underside of that history, the untold story of urban Catholic life on Boston's social, economic, and ecclesial peripheries. More than a century of local, national, and international migrations had shaped and reshaped the cultural landscape of Eggleston Square, transforming cross streets into religious and ethnic boundaries, and St. Mary's into a kind of way station in between them. By the 1920s, the parish boundaries encompassed the contentious borderline between Catholic and Jewish-occupied blocks of Upper Roxbury. In the 1940s and 50s, African Americans moving northward during the Great Migration settled in the neighborhood, eventually catalyzing urban white flight and transforming St. Mary's into a home for Black Catholics. Successive migrations from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic prompted the addition of a Spanish Mass in 1971. By 1979, St. Mary's had also become home to a Catholic Laotian Khmu refugees in the city, while a Haitian community prompted the ad hoc addition of French and Creole ministries. By the 1980s, the tiny church was sustaining a community of some 40 nationalities. If European Catholic immigrants spent the 20th century becoming white, as the narrative goes, the people of St. Mary's spent much of that same period negotiating their place within a church that the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus in 1968 called primarily a white racist institution. By the time the Second Vatican Council summoned the church to solidarity with the world, then, St. Mary's had long since thrown in its lot with the people of Upper Roxbury, forging community and working for peace in the face of racism, poverty, violence, and institutional neglect. While their suburban counterparts were supposedly busy ingratiating themselves into the American middle class, St. Mary's was serving a Black, Caribbean, Latin American, Laotian, Irish, and Italian American community of immigrants, refugees, and workers. St. Mary's never enjoyed the sort of stability that Catholics supposedly achieved during the 20th century. The stability that St. Mary's offered its people was wrought neither by suburban proximity to wealth and security, nor by the comfort of an insular cultural haven. Rather, it was won through decades of enduring presence. When the 2004 tidal wave of parish closers tried unsuccessfully to come for St. Mary's, the Boston Globe declared the tiny church the lifeblood of the neighborhood. By the time I moved to Roxbury, St. Mary's had spent more than a century operating on a shoestring budget in a basement church in the heart of Eggleston Square. How did the people of St. Mary's manage to defy the racial, ethnic, and economic fragmentation that has so long defined U.S. parish life in general and Boston Catholicism in particular? This is the sort of question ordinarily pursued by sociologists and historians, but it's also a theological question. Since Vatican II, few questions have so occupied the attention of church scholars as that of the relationship between ecclesial unity and cultural diversity. Yet, despite the need for more critical ways of thinking theologically about race, culture, and alterity, Catholic ecclesiologies have largely neglected the concrete experiences and specific histories of ecclesial communities of difference on the ground. In turn, we've struggled to perceive racism, ethnocentrism, economic inequality, and other structures of injustice not only as ethical problems, but as ecclesiological problems. St. Mary's, it seemed to me, was not just a fascinating outlier, right? A quirky parish in an iconic Catholic city that has beaten every conceivable odds. The things that made St. Mary's unique were visible signs of the constructive communal theological work that had been unfolding there over the course of decades. What I encountered in Roxbury was a community that had stayed alive by making solidarity an ecclesial virtue. If justice is what love looks like in public, as Cornel West writes, then theologically, we might also say that solidarity is what communion looks like in practice. And as I excavated the St. Mary of the Angels parish files in the Archdiocesan archives, I was amazed to trace the development of this commitment to solidarity back decades and decades into the most unassuming of places. One of those thoroughly unassuming places, I discovered, was the Parish Pastoral Council. On one level, it's hard to think of anything less radical than a Parish Pastoral Council. Following Vatican II's Apostolicam Actuositatem and Lumen Gentium, the Archdiocese of Boston released a series of guidelines urging parishes to form parish councils quote, for that uniting of hierarchy and laity, which the council sees as absolutely necessary. As you can see from these excerpts, there's a lot of emphasis on where people should sit while having their parish council meeting. I appreciate the symbolism in it, but it seems to be a frequent, it's in all the editions. Some of the initial details were hazy. The structure and purpose of parish councils would be reinterpreted and clarified and eventually codified in the 1983 revision of the Code of Canon Law. And yet, at St. Mary's, parishioners aching for a sense of agency perceived an opening and ran through it, and they ran through it right away, establishing a parish council of their own around 1969, which is really early. Seizing the post-conciliar ethos of openness and pastoral collaboration, laity leaned into this novel parish council structure and the power it seemed to afford them in order to place their struggling parish, and the parish was struggling, into a relationship of costly solidarity with the increasingly marginalized communities they served. The initial 14-person council included 6 laymen, 5 laywomen, the parish's deacon, and 2 priests. During the spring and summer of 1969, the council made a series of bold decisions. In March of 1969, the council voted unanimously to transfer the parish's bank accounts from the First National Bank of Boston to Unity Bank and Trust of Roxbury, Boston's first Black-operated bank. Council chairperson Darrell Simpson explained in a letter to the pastor, who was evidently not present at the meeting, that the transferal, quote, of our parish funds, you notice this section is really laughing over here, the St. Mary's section, that the transferal of our parish funds to this bank is a small but eloquent expression of attitude on the part of the parish and the church. In actively supporting the bank, we show an interest in the community and its people who are parishioners. Please inform the diocese of our decision, the letter concluded. So it's not a request. So Father William Coulter did as the parish council directed. Composing a letter to the chancery to request the transfer of funds, he attached a copy of the parish council's letter to his own. At the chancery, the letter set off alarm bells. The amount of power that clergy at St. Mary's had apparently ceded to laity was unfathomable. I believe there are 2 problems here, began an internal memo from the Archdiocesan Chancellor to Cardinal Cushing. Quote, it is my understanding that the council is not policy making, but it is rather advisory in nature. If it is policy making, then we have no choice but to agree. I question whether it is policy making, for this would place the cardinal in a subordinate role. The second problem was financial. Unity Bank and Trust charged higher fees than the parish's current bank did. The decision would cost the cash-strapped parish money that it barely even had. Cushing ultimately granted the request, but only under the condition that Coulter advised the headstrong parish council as to their proper place in the administrative structure of the parish. Outside of it. But the council persisted, undeterred by Cushing's rebuke of the authority they claimed. They had begun their work by rethinking their community's economic commitments. Now they shifted their focus to liturgical life. That spring, at the behest of the St. Mary's Spiritual Development Committee, the parish council voted unanimously to request archdiocesan permission to celebrate the Sunday Mass on Saturday evenings during the summer on the basis of pastoral experiment. Some good Vatican II language for you. The anticipatory Sunday or Saturday liturgy, which we all, of course, now take for granted, was an outcome of Vatican II's implementation was still sort of under development at the time. For the people of St. Mary's, offering Mass on Saturday evenings instead of Sunday would address what they called a pastoral liturgical problem, which seems very evident during the summer season each year. And that was, as they wrote, the unfortunate conflict between Sunday Mass participation and legitimate recreation outside the city on the one day when this is possible. The council went on to explain, we realize that this conflict exists in many parishes, yet we realize that most of our people do not have the pleasure of a summer cottage or the luxury of weekends away from home. Economically, this is out of their reach. The only opportunity for any relaxation away from the oppressive pace and heat of the city is a day trip on Sunday. If Saturday Mass were not possible, the council prepared an unconventional workaround to propose. They suggested perhaps the parish could begin the Sunday liturgy at midnight. All right. Always thinking. When they didn't receive a reply, Father Perry phoned the chancellor, who responded that he, quote, considered it somehow inappropriate that the letter should come from the parish council rather than from the parish administrator. Cardinal Cushing dismissed the inventive midnight mass idea, which I do think was a very good idea. But at the council's repeated urging, he applied to the Holy See for the dispensation necessary to celebrate the Sunday liturgy on Saturday evenings. When the Vatican finally granted the dispensation, it gave Cushing the authority to allow the accommodation to any parish in the archdiocese that requested it. In post-conciliar Boston, then, the first Saturday evening masses were celebrated because working-class, city-dwelling laypeople insisted that they deserved a day of rest. Examining the reception of the Second Vatican Council's reform of the liturgy from the site of an urban parish gives us a very different story than the one we're accustomed to hearing about post-conciliar liturgical reform, one that mostly revolves around straw man arguments about guitar masses and felt banners, both of which I love, by the way. Right, but read from the perspective of an urban parish, this is the story of liturgical reform as worker justice. Often, this sort of work is called theology from below, and yet here we also glimpse in those examples the inadequacy of that above-below binary, right? Rather, what we see is this kind of complex, iterative interplay between institution and people, between community and authority, local realities and ritual norms. But it's a story that we can only learn by attending to a particular history, to a particular place, and within that time and place, to the sorts of artifacts rarely considered theological, things like meeting minutes, chancery communications, and pamphlets. Taking seriously the theological agency of concrete communities means reading the stories and practices of these communities as living ecclesiological sources, loci of revelation about the meaning and mission of the church in the world. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that the term parish refers not only to the church building or to the membership, but to the entire territorial space encompassed by a parish's boundary lines. Thus, to tell the story of an urban neighborhood is to tell a story about the church. This remains true even in an age in which enclaves of ethnic Catholic urban life are mostly the stuff of our great-grandparents' memories. Urban neighborhoods like Roxbury's Eggleston Square are borderlands, making them important sites of reflection on the reality of the church today. Theologian Natalia Imperatori Lee, drawing on the work of late Mujerista theologian and ethnographer Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, observes that the church in the United States is a displaced church, made up in large part of the kinds of people that Isasi Diaz calls multi-sites persons, who live in the interstices of culture. Today, as ecclesial communities are transformed by migration and displacement and gentrification and pandemic-era shifts in practice, other forces of social change, urban parishes offer rich and often hard-won insights into the possibilities and limits of community in an in-between church. 65 years ago, Karl Rahner wrote a piece arguing that the parish was overdue for theological consideration. But it's never too late. So let me suggest, following Rahner 65 years later, that the time is now. It's not my goal here this evening to lay out an intricate methodological justification for this sort of ethnographic theological work, though I eagerly pursue those questions elsewhere. Here I want to do something much more modest, which is simply to make a case that parishes are worth studying, and they're worth studying rigorously and generously, and that attending to parishes, especially those on urban peripheries, makes legible the organic continuity between the vocations of theology and ministry. To illustrate what I mean, I want to tell one final long story. Although we're celebrating Easter, I'm going to take us back for the second time this evening to Good Friday, which my Candler students would tell me is very Catholic of me. I teach Protestant students. And they're always telling me when I'm being very on brand for a Catholic. I tell this story because I think it's a revelatory story, but I also tell this story, which I narrate in greater detail in chapter 4 of People Get Ready, because it began, of all things, as my MTS thesis here. So it seemed like a fitting sort of full circle contribution to this evening. A few weeks before Christmas, in 1976, Father Jack Rusin arrived to take up his new assignment at St. Mary of the Angels. The priest who'd preceded him had sent one final letter to the chancery before departing his post. It concluded with 2 words and 4 exclamation marks. Total disaster! Exclamation marks. Decades of racialized neglect had left Roxbury's parishes in a desperate state, and St. Mary's, the smallest of them, was most desperate of all. The front door on the parish house was boarded up with plywood, and paint was peeling in sheets off the aluminum siding. Inside, Father Jack found the house flooded and overrun with cockroaches and rats. Next door, the church still languished under its original roof, held together by a constellation of patches through which leaks had shorted out most of the lights. At Mass, his first Sunday, Father Jack was greeted by 8 parishioners and a collection of $8.80. That's not very much. Luckily, Father Jack was a believer in what Sister Catherine McGrath, his longtime collaborator, called shoe leather ministry. The church, he believed, should meet people, especially young people, where they were, which was incidentally not inside the crumbling parish. As gang violence in Roxbury intensified throughout the 1980s, Father Jack became a fixture on the streets of Eggleston Square. He was only 30 when he was assigned to St. Mary's, and he was funny and earnest and apparently smoked incredibly large quantities of cigarettes, all traits that gave him credibility among the neighborhood's youth, including members of the X-Men, a local gang made up mostly of Puerto Rican teens who lived in nearby Academy Homes developments. Negotiating the relationship between the X-Men and the community was delicate work. In January 1990, some guys threw a Molotov cocktail onto a parked police vehicle from the roof of a tenement down the street from the parish. To try and calm the conflict, Father Jack hosted weekly meetings between the X-Men and local leaders in the St. Mary of the Angels parish house. The gang members wanted jobs and a place to hang out. Police, for their part, demanded the X-Men stop tagging the elementary school. They compromised. If the graffiti stopped, Principal Margarita Muniz agreed to open the school gym on Saturday mornings for basketball games between the teens and police officers. Progress also took more aesthetic forms. The Eggleston Square Neighborhood Association hired muralist Roberto Chow to work with the teens to channel their affinity for fugitive public art into the creation of a giant mural along nearby School Street. The finished product was a montage of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Puerto Rican heroes like Roberto Clemente and Willie Colon, and independence activist Pedro Albizu Campos. Their faces appeared underneath the Puerto Rican flag and fists emblazoned with the words Latino power. I think I have a picture of it somewhere here. There we go. Alongside them, blue bubble letters broadcasted a tensive mix of territorialism, unity, and hope. "We are all in the same gang," it read. "Stop the violence." Another creative act of resistance took the form of ritual, the Good Friday Neighborhood Way of the Cross, an annual Via Crucis that led participants along the path of Eggleston Square's own passion. There were stations in front of liquor stores notorious for selling alcohol to minors and on corners where drive-by shootings had ended young people's lives. Once the procession stopped at the site of a housing complex destroyed by arson where parishioners had lived. It was Station 10. Jesus is stripped of his garments. Another year, they prayed in front of the police station. St. Mary's organizers began inviting other churches to join the walk. Each congregation would walk a way of the cross through its own neighborhood before coming together for a concluding ritual, usually at an MBTA station. One year, members of each church brought carnations to represent the number of young people killed that year from their respective neighborhoods. There were 30-something from St. Mary's and 7 or 8 from another church, Sister Catherine recalled. We had about 40 or so carnations altogether. And at Jackson Square Station, where the groups came together, we measured off a gravesite and put the carnations on the grave in memory of the kids that year that were killed. In a community where gang territorialism defined geographies of belonging, movement across neighborhood borderlines was both a political and a theological act. You know, when you've got gang-related issues, Sister Catherine once explained to me, you don't really cross over into another area. And so the way of the cross was our way of saying, no, we're coming together as one. In Boston, gangs coalesced residentially around particular neighborhoods and housing projects. Within this milieu, Eggleston's borderland status also made it something of a battleground. Several bus lines intersected at Eggleston Station, making it a common stop for anyone traveling between Roxbury or Jamaica Plain or Dorchester or Mattapan. Every other city gang member needed to come through Eggleston in order to get to places, recalled former X-Men member Will Morales. More on him in a moment. He continued, "Can you imagine if you're at war with different people in the world and they needed to come through a terminal to get home? So while they're waiting for their ride home, they would do their damage and then take somebody else's place. And so we felt the threat of the gang epidemic as a result of the fact that people kind of came through here. And we also began to respond to that threat very quickly. We wanted to protect our neighborhood, protect our families, protect our friends, protect our investments. We didn't want people to just come through here and take over." In this way, the church's selection of MBTA bus and subway stations as meeting points for the conclusion of the Way of the Cross was theologically significant. The stations symbolized the living connections between neighborhoods, even as they recalled the story of Roxbury's complicated past. Since Eggleston's earliest days as a streetcar suburb, the transportation lines had been an ambivalent force, a source of both unity and division, development and destruction. The turn-of-the-century streetcars that welcomed German and Irish immigrants to Roxbury, the elevated Orange Line whose shady tracks spurred eager growth in Parish building followed by stark divestment, the homes raised for the abandoned Southwest Expressway project that would have decimated the neighborhood, the bus lines that continued to crisscross and converge in Eggleston Square even after the Orange Line tracks had come down. The Stations of the Cross mounted around the periphery of a church sanctuary convey the gathered assembly sense of being contained within the memory of a journey, surrounded by the story of suffering and hope and resurrection. If MBTA stations could be stations of the cross, then the city, too, was a church. The bus and subway lines that traversed the city, dotted with their familiar litany of stations, mapped the stational liturgies of everyday life, ordinary ways of sorrow and hope that trace the cartography of the community's passion. By the end of the summer, hope for Eggleston Square felt increasingly tangible. Saturday basketball games and collaborative projects meant that teens and police officers now knew each other by name. The situation seemed to improve so much that a headline on the editorial page of the Boston Globe proudly proclaimed an Eggleston Square comeback. But the comeback proved fleeting. And in the neighborhood's Memoria Passionis, one station marked a breaking point. Will Morales and his younger brother Hector were 2 of the many teens Father Jack mentored. As kids, the brothers moved from Brooklyn to Roxbury with their mom. The family was poor and continuously on the brink of eviction. Will eventually started selling drugs to support his family. He gained status on the block and quickly ascended through the ranks of the X-Men. Hector, on the other hand, was a soft-spoken teenager who loved chess and art. He'd helped to paint the mural on School Street and had taught himself to play 5 instruments. Most of all, he wanted nothing to do with the X-Men. But a couple of unprovoked attacks from members of a rival gang left him shaken and defensive. After Will was sent to prison on drug charges, Hector reluctantly took his brother's place on the block. On the night of November 24th, 1990, 2 plainclothes police officers approached Hector and a group of guys who were hanging out on the corner of Washington and School Street. Hector and the officers knew one another well. They played basketball together. According to reports, the officers had been tipped off to a planned shootout between Hector and members of a rival gang, and they were there to preempt it. Accounts describe their approach as tense but not aggressive. In a moment that no one, in the chaotic days that followed, could quite explain, Hector pulled out a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with birdshot and fired at the two officers. They returned fire, hitting Hector 4 times. The officers sustained minor injuries. Hector died at Boston City Hospital 3 hours later. In the combustible days that followed, Father Jack worked with other community leaders to keep the peace on the streets. At one of several hastily organized community meetings, Hector's mother, Clara Hernandez, got down on her knees, sobbing, and in Spanish begged the X-Men not to avenge her son's killing. Father Jack issued the same plea, encouraging the teens to take some time to mourn their friend before launching into revenge. They took his advice. 2 days after the shooting, some of Hector's friends fashioned a cross out of sticks and hung it on the side of the building above the place where he was shot. That night, they crowded, along with 200 other mourners, into St. Mary's for Hector's wake. As they filed up the aisle to pay their respects, they signed their names on his Puerto Rican flag-draped casket. The next day, 350 people pressed into the pews for Hector's funeral. Mourners overflowed the sanctuary, spilling up the steps and onto the sidewalk. As the mass concluded, pallbearers carried Hector's casket up the basement church's steep stairway. They didn't stop for the hearse. Instead, they made a right turn down Columbus Avenue and, as Will Morales described it, just kept walking. As people fell into a procession behind the casket, Hector's funeral became a spontaneous Via Crucis. Led by the dead on the shoulders of the living, parishioners, neighbors, and rivals walked side by side down the middle of the city street to the corner where Hector had been shot. Across the street was the mural he and his friends painted that summer. 3 days earlier, it had read, "Stop the violence." But after Hector was killed, someone took white spray paint and scribbled over the word "stop." Now the wall proclaimed "the violence just begun." Above the image of Malcolm X, somebody had scrawled, "Heck." That spring, on Good Friday, 1991, the neighborhood way of the cross followed the same route Hector's impromptu funeral procession had taken, up from the basement, down Columbus Avenue, to the corner of Washington and School Street. At the place where her son was shot, Clara stood before the crowd and spoke of her anguish. That year, the corner marked Station 4, Jesus Meets His Mother. 20 years later, I walked the neighborhood way of the cross for the first time. Many Good Fridays at St. Mary's. We visited the home of a late parishioner named Olive Moore. We visited the Barbara McGinnis house and the Eggleston Square Peace Garden. And at the end, members of the youth group handed out cups of dirt and sunflower seeds, and we planted sunflowers around the parish gate. And by the time we gathered in the parish house yard for the Pentecost potluck 50 days later, the sunflowers had shot up above our heads with resurrection vigor. The ritual quietly transformed me, burrowing itself into my own urban imagination. I experienced the city differently after my first St. Mary's Way of the Cross. For weeks, every bus ride felt strangely like an act of anamnesis. Its rhythmic stops and starts, a liturgy of memory through the ordinary places of dying and rising that I had come to recognize in this community I'd begun to call my own. St. Mary's, I realized one rainy afternoon while waiting for the bus, was not unlike the MBTA station under whose smoky concrete eaves I was hunched with damp and grumbling neighbors, all of us breathing puffs of frosty vapor into one another's shoulders. The parish was a stop along the way, a meeting point formed by crossings. Few had arrived there from the same place or for the same reasons. What united us was this collision of presences, ours, others, God's. We were there, shoulder to shoulder, willing enough to get on board, willing enough to bear with one another along the way. So what does it mean to listen for God in a city parish? Whose exclamations of joy and hope rise up through the basement doors? Whose grief and anguish meet our ears? What do we find when we look for God at potlucks and parties and parish pastoral council meetings, in the nail salon or the tattoo parlor or the corner Dunkin' Donuts? or on the 22 bus, or on the Orange Line train. It matters where we do theology. And I'm not referring here to an ethereal, theoretical where, or even like a hermeneutical where. I'm talking about actual places. It matters where we plant ourselves. Place often gets a gauzy treatment in theology, but thinking theologically from some place requires that we think and work historically, archivally, politically, decolonially. Places are not innocent. They don't just appear, they're made. To do theology from a place thus requires scrutinizing histories of migration and transnationalism and shifting boundaries of belonging, histories of development and redevelopment, of redlining and zoning, of colonization and conquest. It requires us to confront the things we don't want to know, things we wish weren't part of the story, the details that interrupt whatever easier, cleaner, purer image of the church or of community we'd been using as a placeholder for reality. Why, for example, did St. Mary's have the same tyrannical pastor for 37 years, from 1916 to 1953, despite files in the archives filled with complaint letters about him from parishioners and neighbors and fellow priests? It was because bishops habitually treated, even then, small, poor, urban parishes as dumping grounds for problem clergy. Shuffling harmful priests off to already precarious communities, church leaders participated in the production of the very inner city whose deprivation they would go on to lament. Thinking geographically helps to chasten and depristinate our reading of the signs of the times. Theology from a where also implicates a whom. We should all be able to answer the question, who is this for? Who is this work for? Planting ourselves somewhere makes our work accountable to concrete communities. If I spend months in a community and interview dozens of people and listen to their stories and comb through their documents and write the same book I could have written if I just stayed in the library, then I've listened, but to what end? In listening, I've made myself accountable to real communities. What have I done with what they've entrusted me? Genuine listening requires openness to the unknown, to reaching conclusions that I couldn't have come to in any other way. It requires a willingness to shift the telos of the journey, to hold our conclusions lightly, to be surprised and delighted, to fall in love, to change. The Code of Canon Law defines the parish as a certain community of the faithful, stably constituted. Indeed, the geographic stability of the Catholic parish is the factor that most distinguishes it from the congregational structure common to most other Christian denominations and religious traditions. Congregations are about membership, and they can shift and relocate and open and close. Parishes, on the other hand, are a matter of cartography, right? They're about maps. Yet stability is a curious charism in our age of religious tumult. Churches in the Northeast and Midwest are being closed and merged. We know this too well here, disproportionately affecting urban communities. Decades of clergy sexual abuse revelations have undermined trust in the church as an institution. The COVID-19 pandemic has upended religious practice in disorienting ways. Congregational affiliation is on the decline. In what sense is the parish stable? I'd like to suggest that the parish is not stable like a fortress. It's stable like a train station. Like the streetcar barn that was the site of its earliest liturgies, and like the elevated rail station whose construction brought waves of change to Eggleston Square, St. Mary's was a way station for people on the move. People would come and stay for a short time or a lifetime, and some would leave or move or settle back in their home countries and return to visit later, and St. Mary's was there, basement doors open, ready to receive whoever showed up next, even those who showed up with muddy shoes. And I think that's what parishes are, places of sojourn for a migrant church. Thank you.
Susan, that was wonderful. Thank you so, so much. Really. It's my pleasure now to present to you STM's 4th Annual Alumni Distinguished Award. But I'm so touched by what you said about how much you learned not just from the STM, but from the people at St. Mary's. I wonder if the people from St. Mary's would like to present this award with me. Would you please come up? Please come up. Please come up. Fernando, you can come up too.
Yeah.
Fernando Josue?
Yeah. They're all
Jonathan, Jonathan,
Jonathan, where's
Jonathan.
Yeah, please.
3 Jesuits who are part of it.
And Liz, and Liz is here. Okay, good.
Fernando baptized how many people this Easter Vigil? Oh!
And we all walk.
you read this?
Go, Alvin.
Could you read this?
Yes, oh, how perfect. All right, then we'll walk on this side. Go, Alvin.
Starting,
Starting here.
good. Thank you. We're thrilled to honor you, Susan, as you have embodied the mission of the School of Theology and Ministry in your work, in your ministry, and as a theologian at Emory University. Your courses and many published works demonstrate your commitment to the intersection of theology and lived Catholic faith, especially life on the margin. The good work that you are doing in the classroom, in print, and in your ministries will have lasting positive effect in the church and the world.
You want to add any personal words?
You were born into this.
Actually, as a true professor, well, I remember sitting in the parish house at St. Mary, giving you the history as I knew it, as you were doing your research some 10, 12 years ago. But listening to you today, I was your student because I was learning so much that I didn't know. I think we often think that the world begins the moment we step into it and don't remember that there is a history, but we need to learn from that history. And that's what you are encouraging us to do, and to have and build a church, an urban ministry that is sustained by that history, but is focused in helping us to go forward as a people of God. So thank you. Susan Bigelow Reynolds, it is our honor, on behalf of the Boston College of Theology and Ministry, to award you this Alumni Distinguished Service Award.
Did you get a good picture here?
We'll take a group. Okay, we'll take a group shot.
Do we want to stand over there?
Come on this side. Podium also. That's great.
Yeah, you can be in the middle.
I don't want to.
Join the party.
wants to take a picture?
BC, I don't know. The people of BC, you might not have had a choice, but thank you for including us.
All right.
Great. So now, per STM continuing education tradition, there's a discussion question for you to speak with a neighbor about for the next 4 to 5 minutes. And Susan, would you please share the question?
The question is taken from my children's kindergarten class. But no, I thought I was asked to prepare a discussion question, which I thought, that's very nice. So I decided to offer this painting by one of my favorite Boston artists, the legendary Alan Rohan Crite, who is a African-American Anglican artist who painted and did pen and ink drawings and etchings and woodcuts and all kinds of things of sort of everyday life in the South End in Roxbury. But he often inserted into his scenes of everyday urban life the Madonna and Child. And he has a whole series of Madonna and Child depictions on various forms of public transportation, including the Orange Line, which is very appropriate to tonight's lecture. This one is called a Streetcar Madonna. So I thought I would offer you this really evocative image painted within the context of Roxbury, and just offer you 2 questions that my daughter's kindergarten teacher begins their lessons with. What do you notice, and what do you wonder? So take a moment and just sort of consider this really lovely depiction of Mary on the way. All right, I've been invited to bring us all back together and commence the Q&A portion of the evening. There are students with mics, so if you have, you are invited to share your responses to the questions at hand, or just ask another question. I also, the comment as question is sort of maligned, but I really think that's great. I love comments, because I think it's great to know what you're thinking. So if you have a comment, that's also great. Yeah, so we'll open it up. Oh, we have one right here. Yeah.
Hold on a second, just so the online community.
Understood. Well, Father and I both had different perceptions of this scene. Originally, Father was thinking, and I hope you don't mind me saying it, that for you, that Lady in Green is probably quite distressed and upset that that black family is sitting on the same train with them. I perceived it more that this is the Lady in Green was a mother, maybe chastising her daughter for whatever it was she wore.
Oh. Oh. I love that. The power of perception, right? Oh, we have a question right here.
Thanks. Susan, it was a great presentation. It was just fascinating. I've got sort of 2 questions. One, and Father and I were conjecturing on this during the time, but you talked about how Father Jack Rusin came in 1976 and the rats were bigger than the collection and things were going the wrong way. What happened to this vibrant parish sort of, from the 30s, 40s, 50s immigrant parish till 1976? What sort of happened there that caused that? And then the second question I've got, I go to a parish in the tough streets of Newton, and
wow, you're so brave.
And I go to 8 o'clock mass, and I can count the number of people on the, maybe using my toes sometimes, and I'm wondering what's the essence that, say, Mary of the Angels had when you boiled all this down, that if you were going to distribute bottles tonight for people to go back to their parishes, what would be some of the key things that we need to take with us to begin to bring this spirit? So 2 questions, pre-76, and what's the secret sauce?
That's a great, and what's the, yes, and then solve all the woes. No, the history question is a great one. And if you want to read more about it, I have a great book for you. No, so it's a very interesting story, actually. So a big part of that story is the fact that for really the first, 40 years practically of their existence, they had this really tyrannical pastor who drove lots of people away from the parish. People were writing in to the chancery complaining about his outrageous homilies, about his controlling nature, about his aggressiveness toward their Jewish neighbors. Even fellow priests would write in begging to be transferred. They're like, I've been in ministry for decades, and this is the first time I've ever written a letter like this. I can't work with this guy. And he was never transferred. And as a result, people left. And this was still in the era in which you kind of went to your territorial parish. There's a lot of, if you look in an archdiocesan archives, a diocesan archives, you have people writing in sort of requesting permission from the bishop to go to a different parish sometimes. And then the response is always like, yeah, like you can do that if you want to, I guess. You don't need my permission. But that's just to say that the sense of belonging to one's local parish was very strong. And people would say in their letters, like, I'm gonna vote with my body here. I'm gonna leave. The only letter that was signed by a woman, some were anonymous, so they might have been written by women, said basically she'll contribute to the Christmas and Easter collections, but she's going to go to a different parish the rest of the time to hear the Mass said as it should be said. And so by the time the 1960s rolled around, St. Mary's was already a parish in distress because it had suffered from institutional neglect so severely. By that point, too, in the 1960s, and an important thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind is that historically, we talk a lot about Vatican II and like the 60s culturally, the sexual revolution, things like that. But another sort of historical conjuncture that gets neglected a lot is the confluence between Vatican II and the war on poverty. And in urban contexts, that confluence of those two events really kind of sparked the unique response to Vatican II that came to be instantiated in all these urban ministries. So sort of toward the end of Vatican II, around 1964, the Archdiocese, St. John's here in Brighton, actually in 1963 started sending seminarians on kind of like summer immersion, urban immersions to the inner city, and they would like work, and it's actually really fascinating to think now, like, gosh, this was a different time. They were working in voter registration drives and democracy projects, and also conducting like parish censuses and working with the people and visiting them in their homes, but kind of like an urban plunge in the parishes of Roxbury. And in 1964, Cushing decided to formalize that into what he called the Roxbury Apostolate. And as far as I can tell, nobody has written about this. This seems to be something that's just sort of lost to time. But you can find it in People Here at chapter 3. But essentially what happened was that a group of seminarians came back from this summer immersion and typed up what they sort of very earnestly called the Roxbury Report, and dedicated it to our first Catholic president, John F. Kennedy. But basically it was this communique of sort of what they'd learned, their insights. And as a result, as a response, Cushing started an apostolate for Roxbury, and he sort of put a call out to all the priests in the archdiocese, asking for volunteers ready to, give their all to the poorest of the poor. And he got a lot of volunteers. And they started in 3 parishes, and St. Mary's was one of those parishes. And essentially they installed a couple of priests and a deacon in each one of these parishes. There was a long debate in the meeting minutes about whether the parish structure was actually any good for confronting like these really challenging situations. And they said, it's what we've got, so we'll work within the structure, but we'll do things differently. We won't call it a rectory, we'll call it a parish house. Kind of all this like open the doors, Vatican II stuff. And the program lasted for a couple years, and what became of it is not clear. It just seemed to atrophy. It ended. There wasn't a follow-up. It was sort of this thing happened for a couple of years, and then that commitment, like so many others to the inner city, just sort of faded away. And so by the time the late 1960s and 1970s rolls around, you have this same and really actually kind of an even deepening and worsening neglect of inner city spaces, not only by the city, not only by municipal authorities, but also by the church. And so in some way, people like Father Jack are the examples of priests who were willing to do this work in really sort of a prophetic, but also sort of a lonely way. There were long periods of time during those decades in which they didn't have a priest at all. In fact, the right before Father Jack got there was this sort of State of Roxbury joint letter published by the clergy of Roxbury, and it wasn't even co-signed by St. Mary of the Angels because they didn't even have a priest at that point. Men were refusing assignments to the inner city. And so that's the nutshell history, but that's a great question. And it's a really interesting history, not because it's unique, but I think actually because it's quite common. It's kind of emblematic of a lot of different forces and trends that were at play at the time. In terms of the kind of upshots, the takeaways, I always say that the thing that I took away from St. Mary of the Angels in terms of like, if there are like best practices here or something, what are they? I always say it's too many cooks in the kitchen is a good thing. It's always better to have too many cooks in the kitchen than no cooks in the kitchen. And a lot of times, candidly, guys, I'm like, this meeting is gonna go on for a very long time and nothing is gonna probably get decided, but wow, there are a lot of people that seem to care. And awesome. Sometimes people like, certain people would bring like wine to meetings, like just one of those big ones from the grocery store, and like that was always really nice for times such as these. But the invitation to lay involvement and investment in everything from, liturgy planning to spirituality to retreats to social justice ministries. And a lot of that was forged out of necessity, right? I mean, we can talk about lay ministry now, but the communities that do lay ministry the best, and I'm not just talking about the United States, look at, countries like Brazil, remote dioceses that don't have priests. So they have lay ministers because they have to. You develop these systems, and St. Mary's had to have lay leadership, or else they would have had no leadership. The other thing that I think is really important to remember, and that I think St. Mary's kind of calls our attention to, are these alliances between church and neighborhood, right? A lot of times we think of Catholic parishes as like islands, but we're part of ecologies. And there's a whole chapter in the book about how St. Mary's successfully won its fight against closure. And they did it essentially not by standing outside their parish saying, we built this parish, please don't close it, because they didn't build the parish. None of them built the parish, right? This is a parish of migrants and parish transplants and spiritual exiles and everybody else. They did it by intentionally setting aside the nostalgia stuff, which is very important, but it doesn't keep your parish open, and instead strategically launching a campaign to convince the archdiocese that the parish was too vital to the neighborhood to close. And they did that successfully. And I think that is an incredible lesson, because in some way, it's sort of the proof point for all of this, solidarity stuff that we're talking about. Like in the end, right, who's gonna vouch for you, right? Right, who's, what's, the mayor, in the end, the real test of whether or not we're living all of that solidarity stuff that we're talking about is whether the community, right, non-Catholics, people that have never stepped foot inside a liturgy but come to all of your bazaars and potlucks and stuff, and Mardi Gras parties, whether it's those folks who march down the street as they did and stand on the lawn as they did and say, don't close this place. So I think that's very instructive as well. That was a very long answer to your question, but I hope that's... Oh, Laurel, and then...
Oh, hi.
yeah.
Hi, Susan. My name's Laurel. Thank you for sharing your work with us. I'm moved on so many levels. I'm actually interested in hearing from the folks from St. Mary of the Angels who are here. What does it feel like to be the source for theology? What is this experience like for you to hear Susan, after 12 years, reflecting on how time in your parish has changed her, informed her professionally, and what do you think of her conclusions and proposals? And what is this experience like for you, if you don't mind sharing maybe a couple people?
I want to add a footnote to Laurel's question to say that Laurel is also an incredible ethnographer and qualitative, and what she's doing right now is really good research practice, right? She's going back to the sources and saying, what do you think about all this? So.
The parish mission statement, which I can't repeat verbatim, but it encapsulates who we are, and I think it answers your question, that we are a people of Christ. We are a welcoming community, and we are multicultural, and we have a joyful worship. Aha, thank you. Oh, get it back. St. Mary of the Angels is a multicultural and multilingual Catholic community, believers in Jesus Christ and his message. We strive to live our faith in joyful worship, providing spiritual nourishment, a welcoming and inclusive environment, and sense of family in all our activity, and committing ourselves to promote justice in our neighborhood and the broader world. And we read this often. We read it before any meeting that we hold at the parish, and we read it in English and in Spanish. The other thing I would say, there was a parish that came, a neighboring parish, and also a parish from Birmingham, once and asked, how are you successful in blending the English and the Latino community? And a question we asked them is, where do those two populations worship in your church? At both of those churches, they said, well, at the English community, we worship in the main sanctuary, but the Spanish is in the basement. So that's the problem right there. Everybody should be in the same sanctuary, too. And that's really important. And the other quick thing I would say about the history, we had many people, because we've been a multicultural parish for so long, and we had many white parishioners who did not flee the community. Mm-hmm. And we had the people who came up through the civil rights movement, and sort of a combination of all of that and welcoming the new immigrants, as Susan mentioned, that made us really strong. And the other thing that Susan did is he told us one Sunday to stop taking money from the archdiocese, that we have to pay our own way. And that was also very prominent in our ability to stay open, because we were not taking a subsidy from the archdiocese. And there's much, much more.
Do you want to hear the original mission statement that preceded that one? It was the one that was written after the Second Vatican Council. While we see community as the full people of God, we also recognize the need for a responsive, organized, and professional program of Catholic Christian ministry. The end. Which it's such a wonderful, awkward relic of like post-Vatican II anxieties. Like, oh, I don't know. I guess so you were wise to supplant that one. Oh, there's a question in the back here. Oh, yeah, Bill Clark had a question as well.
Thanks. I'm really struck by what you were saying about place, and I've done some writing about that myself. And
Yes, you have.
the thing that really struck me is that my own kind of foundational experience of Parish was in a semi-rural town in Maine, and place. It's hard for me to get place out of my mind as what Parish is all about. But if you just focus on that, then what you get is, okay, these are puzzle pieces that can be moved around, and you can put 5 puzzle pieces together. You can cut a puzzle piece in half and make it, and it's just it's pieces of a map. And when they started closing parishes, it was these wonderful, vibrant communities like you're describing that in so many places were just blown up.
Yep.
Because their puzzle piece was going to be moved to somewhere else. But on the other hand, as you pointed out, with congregation versus parish, if it's just the community in a kind of a nomadic sense, then it's very difficult to pin down a character to that.
Yeah.
And I see some congregations that have started in the center of a city and are now way out in the suburbs somewhere, and it's very difficult to imagine the history that has gotten them there.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if what you're talking about, the parish as way station, do you think that is the place that brings these two kind of vital parts together in a way that makes sense? The geography and the sociology, so to speak, or I would rather say the love between the solidarity. That's the word.
Yeah.
Is that the way you're thinking of it? That you've kind of found the center point that pulls all of those important values together?
I think that's really well said. I mean, I think that's exactly right, because I think the question for me and for folks that do parish ministry on the ground, which I don't. And so for them, they're grappling with this in practice, and I'm just like thinking about it. But it's still that ever-present question of what do we do with reality? Like, the reality is that these are unstable times. The reality is that the boundaries are shifting, both parish boundaries and also just boundaries of belonging and participation. I mean, just COVID itself is an example of that, right? I think that we won't fully understand the repercussions of what that period of interruption in participation, and just like sort of the more psychic griefs and sense of loss and interruptions in our lives will do to religious practice. But I think, it's going to have massive consequences. And so the fact is, people are on the move. People are I live in Atlanta, and the church is growing. It's sort of like if you had 2 maps side by side, and one was like all the Catholic infrastructure in the United States, like universities, parishes, colleges, high schools, and then you had a map of like where the church is growing. It would be the exact opposite map. And so in Atlanta, parishes are huge and booming, and much of that is due to the fact that Atlanta is a hub of migration. And so there's a huge Latinx, Latino presence, Hispanic presence within the Archdiocese, which is like just the northern half of the state. But far beyond Latino Catholics as well. So it's really vibrant, it's really diverse. The Black Catholic presence is really deeply rooted. and sort of like an abiding character of the archdiocese as well. But it's sort of like, it's this place where there's the opposite problem, where instead of people sort of shifting and fleeing and parishes closing and merging, it's people are coming, right? And people are coming and coming and coming, but they too, right? They're coming from some place. We didn't all just kind of sprout up here. And they're coming with their own understandings of what church should be. They're coming with their own places within themselves, right? They're bringing places to the places that they're moving to. I mean, if you look at a lot of the suburbs around Atlanta, especially in the north, Atlanta is a rare city in which the cost of living within the city boundaries is actually higher than outside of it. So migrant communities and me settle outside the city boundaries. In Norcross and Doraville and places like that, and that's where you find these new sort of places, right? And they're the places that they were before, but they're also new places brought by the folks that are coming. And so I think seeing the parish both as this stable place, which I think is really important. I think that's still really important. I think that's what makes a parish, is that sense of stability, groundedness, rootedness, the sense that that this place is going to be here, whether, even if all of the English speakers move out of the neighborhood tomorrow and, a Vietnamese community comes in, that's your parish. Congratulations. And it's going to be there for them just like it was there for everybody else 20, 30, 80 years ago. Like, that's really beautiful to me. But I think we have to hold that understanding of stability loosely enough that we can sort of allow ourselves to see that's really, it's a very dynamic stability. And there's a lot of moving through and going to and coming from. And I think the idea of a train station is kind of a helpful image in that. Yeah. No, that's really well said. Thanks, Bill.
Dr. Reynolds, we've had a number of questions from our online community, so we're going to get one of those in. This will be our last question. James?
Sorry, I've given very long answers, so I should have probably speed it up so we could get more people.
All right, so normally I don't read the names of people who ask online, but I think Terry Gaffney wants me to make sure you know that.
He'd be in the picture here if you were here.
Yeah. Terry congratulates you on your work.
Thank you,
and
Terry.
Says, reading your book, I was reminded of the passage from Matthew. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. This says to me that there is no communion without solidarity. And so a question is, in a society segregated by race and class, how do we pursue solidarity?
Yeah, amen. That's the question of my life. So if anybody has a good answer. But I mean, I think, one way that we do that, I think, is through what I sort of use as an umbrella term in the book to just call ritual. But I think that within a parish, at least, and I think one good thing about parish stability is that you do get a lot of different people sometimes, not always, because when we are segregated residentially, we are also segregated parochially, right? It's kind of like a public school in that way, where if this is your local community and your community mirrors the community that's there, then you're going to get a segregated church community, just like you have a segregated neighborhood. That's why I showed that picture of the homeowner's loan coupon, the Hulk map from 1938, right? That's the circle is Eggleston Square. And you can look and see, yeah, that was 1938. It was redlined in 1938, and it suffered economic catastrophe for decades and decades and decades. So this is why I said, we can't have this gauzy sort of idealized conception of place. Places are made. And so that being said, I think parishes are a space in which we can encounter people who are different from us in ways that's afforded by very few other institutions in our everyday lives. And so that's a real gift. And I think that within those spaces, the work of ritual is very promising, because what ritual allows us to do is inherit essentially this template for acting out the kind of community we wish we could be all the time. Ritual sort of gives us an excuse to do the things that we believe and want to believe, but can't do in ordinary life, right? I can't go up to somebody on in everyday life in the, grocery store and be like, I just really believe that we're all like deeply relational beings. And can we just hold hands right now? Like, this is really, we need one another. That would be so weird. I would get thrown out of the grocery store and I would not be allowed to come back. And that would be bad for all of us, especially my family. But ritual, right, allows us to do things like hold hands and drink out of the same cup of wine and process forward together and sing congregationally and lift our voices together and say the same words and walk in the same footsteps and walk next to each other patiently through the streets in public. These aren't normal, these are ritual actions. Ritual sort of provides this kind of a body language, which is really helpful when you don't speak the same language, right? Ritual sort of, it gives us an excuse for practicing the kind of community that we wish we could always sort of be. And I think in that practicing, we do become slowly, arduously, painfully, the sort of people that we wish we could be all the time.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Reynolds.